Hollow Tides of the Drowned God. Chapter 6. The Hull is the Whole. The air in the Compliance Command Center was as cold and sharp as fractured glass. It smelled of chilled ozone and the faint, sterile bitterness of antiseptic misters, a deliberate and costly assault on the city's perpetual odor of damp metal and brine. Here, 20 levels above the rot of the Sump, Chief Compliance Officer Praxilla Varr had carved out a sanctuary of absolute order. Polished obsidian floors reflected the cold blue lines of tactical displays, and the only sound, besides the near-silent hum of server banks, was the low-frequency groan of Amphitrite's hull, a constant, hated reminder of the chaos she was tasked to suppress. She traced a line on a large, semi-translucent data slate with a stylus, her knuckles white. The preliminary report on the Triton conduit raid was an exercise in frustration. A convoy carrying high-sensitivity medical scanners, destined for her own division's mobile screening units, had been ambushed. Not with brute force, but with impossible precision. A ventilation duct overloaded, blanketing the corridor in superheated steam, disabling the guard's thermal vision and frying the vehicle's electronics. By the time the steam cleared, the scanners were gone. The title lords, no doubt. Grendel Brecker's grubby fingerprints were all over the logistics. But the execution, it was too perfect. Her stylus tapped a rhythmic, impatient staccato on the slate's surface. It was a clean job, surgically clean. There was no evidence, no witnesses who saw a face, no weapon left behind. Just another victory for the Sump's shadow economy, and another entry in a file thick with circumstantial links and impotent fury. She needed more. To convince the Triarch Council of the true threat, to justify the measures she knew were necessary, she needed something they couldn't dismiss as petty crime. She needed a weapon. A soft chime announced a presence at her door. "Enter," she said, her voice flat, not bothering to look up. A young forensic technician, Kalen, stepped inside. He was barely out of his academy training, with a face that still held a trace of spire-born pallor, unmarred by the grease and grime of the lower levels. He clutched a datapad to his chest like a prayer book. "Chief Officer Varr, we've completed the tertiary analysis of the sabotage site." Praxilla swiveled her chair to face him, the movement slow and deliberate. The chair made no sound. Nothing in her office did, unless she permitted it. "Your initial report was concise, technician. It stated the obvious, a localized steam burst triggered by an electrical overload. Hardly revelatory." Kalen swallowed, the motion visible in his thin neck. "Yes, ma'am, but the question was how they targeted the overload so precisely. Rerouting that much power should have triggered fail-safes all the way to the central grid." He stepped forward, projecting his datapad's display into the air between them. A complex schematic of the Triton conduit appeared, interwoven with wavering lines of thermal and energy resonance data. The sabotage wasn't random. They didn't just overload the junction, they exploited a pre-existing weakness. He zoomed in on a section of the main ventilation trunk, a massive artery of dull gray metal. A micro-fissure, almost certainly dating back to the initial construction. It's not on any modern schematic. The city's automated integrity sensors wouldn't even register it. It's too small. To the system, it doesn't exist. Praxilla leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Her frustration began to recede, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. And how would Brecker's rust-rotted thugs know about a century-old structural flaw? That was the question, ma'am, Kalin said, his confidence growing as he delved into his data. There are only two possibilities. Either they have access to first-generation architectural logs, old-world data drives, highly illegal, or they knew it was there through some other means of detection, one not reliant on our technology. The air thickened. Praxilla's mind raced. The Tide Lords trafficked in salvage data, that was known. But this felt different, more intimate, an intuitive, impossible knowledge. The whispers from the Sump, the talk of the echo-touched. She'd always dismissed it as the fungal ramblings of the desperate. "Continue, technician," she commanded, her voice a low hum.
Yes, ma'am. Kalin switched the display. The schematic was replaced by the results of a mass spectrometer analysis. A long, complex chain of data scrolled down the projection. We took particulate swabs from the edges of the microfissure. We found the usual: traces of oxidized iron, copper, saline deposits. And this. He highlighted a single line of code. A protein signature. It was complex, alien, and flagged with a dozen warning protocols. "It's a non-terrestrial protein chain," Kalin explained, his voice hushed with a kind of clinical awe. "Biological, but with a biomineral component. We couldn't identify it, so on a hunch I cross-referenced it with the classified alert from the Sustenance Division, the one from last week." He pulled up another file, a report on the primary water reclamation tanks. And there it was, the same signature, an exact match. Coral Echo. The name stared back at her from the screen. The microorganism, the source of the whispers, the madness, the drownings. The contamination that was supposed to be isolated to the deep foundations and the welders who worked there. Praxilla felt no shock, no horror. Only the clean, bright snap of perfect, chilling clarity. It was like the final gear in a vast, complex machine locking into place. The microfissure wasn't found with old data. It was sensed. The infection wasn't just a plague spreading through the water. It was being used, weaponized. This raid wasn't about stealing scanners. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration of a new, terrifying advantage. The Sump rats and the Tide Lords, the criminals she had fought to contain, had merged with the biological threat she had struggled to define. They hadn't just found a flaw in the city's armor. They had become a flaw in its very biology. This changed everything. This wasn't a matter of public health anymore. It wasn't a crime wave. It was bioterrorism, an act of insurrection. The word was a key, unlocking a door in her mind that led to a path she had always wanted to walk, a path of absolute, necessary action. She looked at the glowing data, the protein signature of the Coral Echo, and saw not a plague, but a signature on a confession. Her smoking gun.
"Excellent work, Technician Kalin," she said. The warmth in her voice was thin and artificial, a layer of ice over a fathomless depth. "You have provided this division with critical intelligence. You will transfer all data to my private server, then delete your local files. You will not speak of this to anyone. This is now a level Omega security matter. Is that understood?" "Yes, Chief Officer," he stammered, taken aback by the intensity in her gaze. He quickly performed the transfer, his hands trembling slightly. It's done, ma'am." "You are dismissed." He practically fled. The door chimed shut, sealing Praxilla back in her cold, silent world. She stood and walked to the reinforced viewport. It displayed no view of the abyss, only a tactical map of Amphitrite glowing in the dim light. Her eyes fixed on the lower third, the chaotic, sprawling lattice of the Sump, now pulsing with a malignant red light on her display. Her frustration was gone, burned away by the cold fire of certainty. They had given her the justification she needed. They had mistaken her methodical nature for hesitation, a fatal error. The hull is the whole, she thought, the city's foundational mantra twisting into a predator's creed in her mind. It was not a plea for unity. It was a biological imperative. A sick limb must be cauterized to save the body. Praxilla stood before the primary tactical display, a monolithic slab of obsidian glass that dominated the circular room. Her reflection was a ghost superimposed over the city she was about to break in two. Sharp cheekbones, hair pulled back into a severe disciplined knot, the high, unforgiving collar of her chief compliance officer's uniform, a dark frame for her pale, focused face. She saw no conflict in her eyes, only the cool, hard light of necessity. On the display, a three-dimensional wireframe of the arcology pulsed with cold blue light. The Sump, the city's deep-rooted foundation, was highlighted in a sickly, cancerous amber. Within that amber stain, thousands of tiny white dots, life sign indicators, swarmed and panicked like agitated microbes under a lens. Red perimeters blinked, marking the quarantine lines where her compliance units, represented by stark blue chevrons, were herding the last civilian stragglers away from the massive pressure bulkheads. Each bulkhead was a guillotine in waiting. She had studied their schematics for weeks, not just the modern hydraulic doors of the mid-levels, but the ancient colossal ones deep in the guts of the city. Doors that hadn't been closed since Amphitrite was first sealed 78 years ago. They were designed for the ultimate catastrophe, a total, abyssal pressure breach. Praxilla was about to use them not to keep the ocean out, but to keep the infection in. The air filled with static, then the wavering, reedy voice of Counselor Thorne from the Sustenance Division. "Praxilla, the Council has voted. In light of the irrefutable evidence you presented," he faltered, the sound of his own cowardice echoing in the sterile room. "We concede. Plenary powers are yours. The Hall Integrity Act is in your hands. May the whole be preserved." The transmission cut out. The final key had turned. The last flimsy barrier of debate and deliberation had dissolved. The aide swallowed, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Ma'am? The Council has fully ceded authority. Your orders?" This was it. The moment of consideration, not of doubt, but of weight. She thought of the city not as a collection of people, but as a single complex organism. The Hall is the whole. It was the first lesson every child learned, a sacred, fundamental truth. The Sump was a limb, and it had become gangrenous. The choral echo was a necrosis spreading through its veins. To hesitate, to allow sentiment for the dying cells to endanger the heart and brain was not mercy, it was madness, it was suicide. Her gaze drifted to the spire atrium at the apex of the holographic model. Clean, spacious, safe, the domain of minds that could not be burdened with the foul realities of the deep. They required protection. They required her. She was the city's immune system, and this was the necessary violent fever required to burn out the disease. The thousands of white dots in the Sump were no longer citizens. They were acceptable losses, the cost of survival. A rounding error in the grand equation of Amphitrite's continued existence. She imagined the moment the order was executed, the deep resonating boom that would shake the lower levels, the grinding shriek of ancient metal moving for the first time in generations, the sudden extinguishing darkness as primary power lines were severed. The screams. She felt nothing. Or rather, she felt what a surgeon feels before the first incision, a profound, cold, and absolute focus. The patient was on the table. The scalpel was in her hand. Her own reflection stared back at her from the glass, her expression as unyielding as the pressure hull itself. This was not an act of cruelty, but an act of purification. Joran, patient zero, was a symptom, the Tide Lords a complication, Hestian and the Echo-touched a delusion. The Sump itself was the tumor, and she was the cure. Slowly, deliberately, she reached forward, her gloved fingers hovering over the console. The young aide flinched, as if she were about to touch something sacred and terrible. Praxilla's fingers brushed against the cold metal of the comm's actuator. She leaned in, her lips almost touching the grill. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, perfectly controlled command that carried the weight of an epoch. It was the calm at the center of the coming storm. Execute hull integrity protocol. Her eyes flickered across the amber-stained Sump on the display, a final dispassionate glance at the world she was about to condemn. The Sump is sealed. A final definitive breath. Her gaze hardened into something beyond steel. Now.